When the armed intruders stormed Lincoln Elementary at 2:47 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, every adult in the building froze in terror except for the soft-spoken third-grade teacher, who had been dismissed by her colleagues as timid and unremarkable. What they didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had spent 8 years as a Special Forces operative in some of the world's most dangerous conflict zones, and the 200 children trapped inside that school were about to witness why her former unit called her Ghost. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses and smoothed down her cardigan as she prepared for another day at Lincoln Elementary School in the suburban town of Maplewood, Connecticut. At 34, she had the appearance of someone who had spent her entire life in quiet classrooms rather than hostile territories thousands of miles away. Her shoulder-length brown hair was always neatly pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of modest blouses, comfortable cardigans, and sensible flats that made no sound as she walked the hallways. To everyone at Lincoln Elementary, Sarah was exactly what she appeared to be: a gentle, somewhat reserved teacher who preferred books to people and seemed to disappear into the background during staff meetings the other teachers had formed there. Opinions about Sarah within weeks of her arrival 3 years ago. She was quiet during lunch breaks, declining invitations to happy hours and weekend gatherings with polite but firm excuses. When conversations turned to current events or world affairs, Sarah would nod along but rarely contributed her own thoughts, leading many to assume she simply wasn't interested in anything beyond her classroom walls. Her teaching style was methodical and calm, never raising her voice even when dealing with the most disruptive students. Parents described her as sweet but unremarkable during conferences, and several had quietly requested transfers to more dynamic teachers for their children. Principal Janet Rodriguez had initially been impressed with Sarah's credentials when she applied for the position. Her resume showed a master's degree in elementary education from Columbia University, glowing references from a private school in Vermont, and impeccable interview responses. However, as months turned into years, Rodriguez began to question whether Sarah possessed the energy and innovation needed for modern education. During faculty meetings, Sarah sat in the back row, taking notes but rarely participating in discussions about new curriculum initiatives or disciplinary policies. When asked direct questions, she provided thoughtful but brief responses that suggested competence without passion. The school's veteran teachers, particularly the tight-knit group led by fourth-grade instructor Margaret Chun, had long since categorized Sarah as pleasant but forgettable. Margaret, who had been teaching for over 20 years and considered herself the unofficial leader of the faculty, often made subtle comments about Sarah's lack of engagement with school social activities. During professional development days, while other teachers formed animated discussion groups, Sarah worked independently, completing required modules efficiently, but without the collaborative enthusiasm that Margaret valued. The younger teachers, fresh out of college with boundless energy and social media savvy, found Sarah's reserved nature particularly puzzling. They couldn't understand why someone their age would choose to eat lunch alone in her classroom rather than join their conversations about weekend plans and dating adventures. Sarah's interactions with parents further reinforced her reputation as competent but uninspiring. During parent-teacher conferences, she provided detailed academic reports and behavior assessments with professional thoroughness, but families left feeling like they hadn't really connected with their children's teacher on a personal level. She knew every student's learning style, dietary restrictions, and family circumstances, but shared nothing about her own life beyond the classroom. When parents tried to engage her in casual conversation about local events or personal interests, Sarah deflected with polite questions about their children's progress, maintaining professional boundaries that some interpreted as Coldness. The maintenance staff and administrative assistants at Lincoln Elementary barely noticed Sarah's presence. She arrived each morning at exactly 7:30, 30 minutes before the required time, and left promptly at 4 o'clock after completing her duties. Her classroom was always impeccably organized, requiring minimal custodial attention, and she never generated the paperwork crises or urgent requests that characterized some of her colleagues. To the school secretary, Mrs. Patterson, Sarah was the teacher who never forgot to submit attendance reports on time, but also never stopped by the office for friendly chats or administrative gossip. Even Sarah's students, third graders aged 8 and 9, had mixed feelings about their teacher. While they appreciated her patience and clear explanations, many found her less exciting than teachers who incorporated games, music, and dramatic flair into their lessons. Sarah's classroom management was flawless. Disruptions were rare, and transitions between activities happened smoothly. But some parents worried their children weren't being challenged or inspired. During school performances and field trips, Sarah remained in the background, ensuring safety and organization while other teachers took center stage with enthusiastic participation and photo opportunities. The truth about Sarah Mitchell's background was buried in classified files that would never see the light of day in a suburban elementary school. Her real name was Captain Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, and she had spent 8 years as a member of the Army's most elite Special Forces unit, conducting counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several countries whose names couldn't appear in public records. Her specialty had been close protection and hostage rescue, skills that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure and the ability to neutralize threats while protecting innocent civilians. She had earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and commendations that would never be fully disclosed due to their classified nature. The transition from military service to civilian life had been more challenging than any combat mission Sarah had ever undertaken. After losing 3 members of her unit in a roadside bombing that she had survived with minor injuries, Sarah made the difficult decision to leave active duty and pursue a completely different path. The guilt of being the sole survivor haunted her dreams, and the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones made normal social interactions exhausting. Teaching had seemed like a natural choice, a way to protect and nurture instead of destroy, to build young minds instead of eliminating threats. The quiet routine of elementary education provided the stability and purpose she needed while allowing her to use her protective instincts in a peaceful environment. Sarah had deliberately chosen Lincoln Elementary in suburban Connecticut because it represented everything her previous life had lacked: safety, predictability, and innocence. The biggest crises she encountered involved scraped knees on the playground, forgotten homework assignments, and occasional disagreements between students over playground equipment. This mundane environment was exactly what she needed to heal from 8 years of constant danger and life or death decisions. She kept her military background completely secret, understanding that revealing her true identity would fundamentally change how colleagues, parents, and students perceived her. The gentle, unremarkable teacher persona wasn't entirely fake. It was the person she desperately wanted to become after years of being someone whose job required violence and strategic thinking. Her modest apartment, 5 miles from the school, contained no visible evidence of her military service. The medals and commendations were locked in a safety deposit box she visited once a year on the anniversary of her unit's final mission. The only hint of her previous life was a small locked gun safe hidden behind winter coats in her bedroom closet, containing a service pistol she hoped never to touch again. Even her emergency contact information listed a cousin in Oregon rather than any military connections, maintaining the careful separation between her 2 identities. Every morning as Sarah Mitchell walked through the cheerful hallways of Lincoln Elementary, past colorful bulletin boards and children's artwork, She reminded herself that this was her real life now. The hyper-awareness that had kept her alive in hostile territories was something she actively worked to suppress, focusing instead on lesson plans and student progress reports. She had convinced herself that the skills she had learned in the military were no longer necessary, that the protective instincts honed through years of training and combat experience could remain dormant in this safe, predictable environment where the greatest threat was a child falling off the monkey bars during recess. The social hierarchy at Lincoln Elementary School was as rigid and unforgiving as any military command structure Sarah had ever encountered. Though the weapons here were gossip, exclusion, and subtle professional undermining, rather than bullets and explosives. At the apex of this carefully constructed ecosystem sat the veteran teachers who had claimed their territory. Through decades of tenure, accumulated influence with administrators, and an unspoken understanding that newcomers needed to prove their worth before being accepted into the inner circle, Margaret Chun commanded the 4th grade wing like a seasoned general, her 23 years of service earning her unofficial authority over curriculum decisions, social events, and the general tone of faculty interactions. Her classroom was strategically located near the main office, allowing her to monitor comings and goings while maintaining easy access to Principal Rodriguez for impromptu consultations that reinforced her status as the school's most trusted educator. Margaret's teaching methods were traditional but effective, producing consistently high test scores that gave weight to her opinions about educational philosophy and school policy. When she spoke during faculty meetings, other teachers listened with the deference typically reserved for someone whose job security and professional reputation were unassailable. Surrounding Margaret were her longtime allies, 5th grade teacher Patricia Williams, who had been Margaret's roommate during their first year of teaching and remained her closest confidant, 2nd grade instructor David Park, whose quick wit and encyclopedic knowledge of district politics made him valuable for strategic information gathering, and kindergarten teacher Linda Foster, whose 30-year tenure predated even Margaret's arrival but who preferred to wield influence through subtle suggestion rather than direct confrontation. This core group controlled the school's social calendar, determined which restaurants the faculty would patronize for celebrations, and established the unwritten rules about everything from dress codes to acceptable topics of conversation in the teachers' lounge. The middle tier of Lincoln Elementary's hierarchy consisted of teachers with 5 to 15 years of experience, who had earned their places through a combination of competence, social adaptability, and careful navigation of the senior faculty's expectations. These teachers understood that their professional advancements depended as much on maintaining good relationships with Margaret's circle as on their classroom performance. They attended the monthly happy hours at Giuseppe's Italian restaurant, contributed enthusiastically to birthday celebrations and retirement parties, and made sure to seek advice from veteran teachers on matters that could easily be resolved independently. Their survival strategy involved being helpful without appearing ambitious, competent without overshadowing their seniors, and social without creating drama. At the bottom of this carefully maintained structure were the newest teachers, recent college graduates who arrived each fall with fresh ideas, boundless energy, and complete ignorance of the complex social dynamics that governed their workplace. These young educators quickly learned that enthusiasm for innovative teaching methods needed to be tempered with respect for established practices, and that questioning traditional approaches during faculty meetings was career suicide. They formed their own subgroup, bonding over shared experiences of navigating administrative requirements, managing difficult parents, and decoding the subtle signals that indicated approval or disapproval from their more experienced colleagues. Sarah Mitchell existed outside this entire hierarchy, neither threatening enough to warrant active hostility nor socially engaged enough to earn acceptance. Her 3 years at Lincoln Elementary had established her as competent, but unremarkable, someone who fulfilled her professional obligations without generating either praise or criticism. The veteran teachers regarded her with polite indifference, occasionally including her in group conversations, but never seeking her opinions or inviting her to join their inner circle discussions. Her consistent punctuality, organized classroom, and absence of disciplinary problems meant that administrators had no complaints about her performance, but her lack of initiative in proposing new programs or volunteering for extra duties suggested. A teacher who was content with mediocrity. Margaret Chen had initially attempted to mentor Sarah during her first semester, offering guidance on everything from bulletin board displays to parent communication strategies. However, Sarah's polite but distant responses to these overtures gradually convinced Margaret that the new teacher preferred to work independently. When Sarah declined invitations to join the veteran teachers for their Friday afternoon debriefing sessions at Giuseppe's, Margaret interpreted this as either arrogance or antisocial behavior, neither of which endeared the newcomer to the established faculty. Margaret's attempts at inclusion became increasingly perfunctory, eventually dwindling to brief nods in the hallway and generic pleasantries during mandatory meetings. The younger teachers found Sarah's reserved nature particularly puzzling because she appeared to be close to their age but showed no interest in forming friendships or participating in their social activities. Third-grade teacher Jessica Rodriguez, the principal's niece and a recent graduate from the University of Connecticut, had repeatedly invited Sarah to join their weekend gatherings, book clubs, and fitness activities, only to receive polite declines that offered no alternative suggestions or explanations. Jessica's initial assumption that Sarah was simply shy had evolved into frustration and eventually indifference as months passed without any breakthrough in their professional relationship. The school support staff had their own perspective on Lincoln Elementary's social dynamics, observing the faculty interactions from a unique vantage point that allowed them to see patterns invisible to the teachers themselves. Head custodian Frank Martinez, who had worked at the school for 15 years, noticed how Sarah always arrived early and stayed late, working alone in her classroom while other teachers gathered in small groups throughout the building. Administrative assistant Carol Patterson observed that Sarah never participated in the informal conversations that occurred in the main office while teachers picked up mail or submitted paperwork, instead completing her business efficiently and departing without engaging in the gossip and speculation that fueled much of the school's social interaction. Even the students at Lincoln Elementary were unconsciously aware of their teachers' social standings, picking up on subtle cues about which educators commanded respect and which ones operated on the periphery of the adult community. Sarah's third graders understood that their teacher was different from others in ways they couldn't articulate, noting her calm demeanor during situations that caused other adults to become flustered or animated. While they appreciated her patience and consistency, many students found themselves drawn to teachers who displayed more obvious enthusiasm and emotional expression, creating an environment where Sarah's classroom was seen as safe but not particularly exciting. The parent community at Lincoln Elementary reflected and amplified the school's internal hierarchy, with certain teachers earning reputations as the most desirable instructors, while others were considered adequate but uninspiring. Margaret Chun's classroom was consistently requested by parents who understood the value of experience and traditional methods, while the younger teachers attracted families seeking innovative approaches and high-energy instruction. Sarah's reputation among parents was neutral. She was neither actively sought nor deliberately avoided, existing in a middle ground of competent anonymity that satisfied parents focused on academic progress, but disappointed those hoping for inspirational teaching that would spark their children's passion for learning. Professional development days and faculty meetings provided regular opportunities for Lincoln Elementary's social hierarchy to assert itself through seating arrangements, discussion participation, and informal networking. Sarah consistently chose seats toward the back of meeting rooms, took notes diligently, and contributed to discussions only when directly asked for input. Her responses were always thoughtful and professionally appropriate, but they lacked the passion and personal investment that characterized contributions from teachers who saw themselves as integral parts of the school community. This pattern reinforced her colleagues' perception of Sarah as someone who fulfilled her contractual obligations without embracing the collaborative spirit that Margaret and her allies considered essential for effective education. The subtle signs of exclusion that characterized Sarah's experience at Lincoln Elementary were often invisible to casual observers, but formed a consistent pattern of professional isolation. She was rarely included in impromptu lunch plans, never invited to participate in the informal mentoring relationships that helped newer teachers navigate district requirements, and seldom asked for her opinions on matters ranging from curriculum adoption to social event planning. Her colleagues weren't deliberately cruel or openly hostile, but their indifference created an environment where Sarah remained perpetually on the outside of the social networks that made teaching more enjoyable and professionally rewarding for her peers. This carefully maintained distance served both sides of the relationship, protecting Sarah's secret while allowing her colleagues to dismiss her as unremarkable and therefore unworthy of deeper investigation or inclusion. Neither party recognized how perfectly this arrangement suited Sarah's needs for anonymity and emotional safety, or how quickly these same social dynamics would shift when the skills hidden beneath her mild-mannered exterior became the only thing standing between the Lincoln Elementary community and unimaginable tragedy, the daily humiliations Sarah endured at Lincoln Elementary were never dramatic enough to warrant complaint or intervention, but they accumulated like small wounds that never quite healed, each incident reinforcing her status as an outsider who didn't quite belong in the tight-knit community she had hoped would become her sanctuary. These slights came disguised as casual observations, helpful suggestions, or innocent oversights that left Sarah questioning whether she was being overly sensitive while simultaneously confirming her decision to maintain emotional distance from colleagues who seemed determined to remind her of her perceived inadequacies. During the October faculty meeting focused on implementing new state testing requirements, Principal Rodriguez asked for volunteers to serve on the assessment committee, a prestigious assignment that would involve working directly with district administrators to develop evaluation protocols. Several hands shot up immediately, including Margaret Chun's and those of her closest allies, but when Sarah quietly raised her hand, Margaret turned to look at her with barely concealed surprise. "Oh, Sarah wants to volunteer," Margaret announced to the room with a tone that managed to sound supportive while simultaneously questioning the wisdom of such a decision. "That's wonderful, though I'm not sure if someone with your limited experience with our district's testing culture would be the best fit for such a complex initiative." The comment drew knowing nods from several veteran teachers, and Sarah withdrew her hand, understanding that her offer had been politely but definitively rejected in front of the entire faculty. The teachers' lounge became a daily reminder of Sarah's outsider status through a series of seemingly innocent interactions that consistently excluded her from the social fabric of the school. When conversations turned to weekend plans, colleagues would discuss their activities with animated enthusiasm until Sarah approached the coffee machine, at which point the energy would noticeably diminish and topics would shift to mundane school business. Jessica Rodriguez, the principal's niece, had initially made efforts to include Sarah in these conversations, but after months of polite but distant responses, her invitations became increasingly perfunctory. "We're going to that new wine bar in Hartford on Friday," Jessica would announce to the room before adding, almost as an afterthought, "You're welcome to join us, Sarah, though I know you're probably busy." The invitation was technically extended, but the tone suggested that acceptance would be surprising and potentially unwelcome. Sarah's teaching methods became a frequent target of subtle criticism disguised as constructive feedback, particularly from Margaret Chen, who had appointed herself as the unofficial guardian of educational standards at Lincoln Elementary. During a casual observation of Sarah's reading lesson, Margaret noted that Sarah's classroom was perhaps a bit too quiet, and suggested that more energetic teaching styles might better engage third-grade students. When Sarah's students consistently scored well on assessments, Margaret attributed this success to the naturally bright demographics of the school district rather than any particular skill on Sarah's part. These comments were always delivered with a smile and framed as helpful observations, making it impossible for Sarah to object without appearing defensive or ungrateful for the guidance. The school's social events provided regular opportunities for Sarah's colleagues to reinforce her marginal status through carefully orchestrated exclusion that maintained plausible deniability. When Linda Foster organized a baby shower for second-grade teacher Amanda Collins, invitations were distributed through a group text message that somehow failed to include Sarah's number. Margaret later apologized for the oversight and extended a verbal invitation, but by then the gift list had been finalized and food assignments distributed, leaving Sarah to attend as an obvious afterthought who brought store-bought cookies, while everyone else contributed homemade dishes that reflected their integration into the school's social network. Parent-teacher conferences revealed another dimension of Sarah's professional isolation when several parents made comments that suggested they had received informal guidance about her teaching approach. Mrs. Henderson, mother of one of Sarah's most challenging students, mentioned during their scheduled meeting that she had heard from other parents that Sarah's classroom might be too structured for creative children. When Sarah asked for clarification, Mrs. Henderson became evasively apologetic, clearly uncomfortable about revealing her sources, but unable to completely retract the implication that other teachers had been discussing Sarah's methods with parents. From outside her classroom, the subtle sabotage extended to practical matters that affected Sarah's ability to do her job effectively. When new educational software was introduced to the district, Margaret Chun volunteered to coordinate training sessions for the elementary faculty, but Sarah's name was somehow omitted from the initial sign-up sheet. By the time the error was discovered, all training slots were filled, leaving Sarah to learn the system through online tutorials while her colleagues benefited from hands-on instruction and collaborative problem-solving. Margaret expressed regret about the administrative mix-up, but suggested that Sarah's independent learning style was probably better suited to self-paced instruction anyway. Professional development opportunities became another vehicle for reinforcing Sarah's outsider status through seemingly objective assessments that consistently undervalued her contributions. When the district announced funding for teachers to attend summer workshops, Margaret was asked to recommend candidates based on their potential for leadership and innovation. Sarah's application was acknowledged but not selected, with feedback suggesting that she needed to demonstrate more collaborative engagement and enthusiasm for professional growth before being considered for advanced training opportunities. The teachers who were selected included several with less experience and lower student achievement scores, but they had all established themselves as integral members of the school's social community. Even routine administrative tasks became opportunities for subtle humiliation. When Sarah's colleagues found ways to highlight her differences from the established faculty culture during mandatory curriculum planning sessions, Sarah's contributions were consistently acknowledged last, after more senior teachers had already shaped the direction of discussions. Her suggestions were often met with polite nods followed by immediate pivots to alternative approaches, creating the impression that her input was being considered while actually being dismissed. Margaret would thank Sarah for her unique perspective before explaining why more traditional methods were probably more appropriate for their student population. The physical environment of Lincoln Elementary reinforced Sarah's marginal status through small details that constantly reminded her of her exclusion from the inner circles of faculty life. Her mailbox was consistently the last to receive important communications, and when bulk deliveries arrived, her classroom was often forgotten, until she made specific requests for materials that other teachers had already received. The bulletin board outside her classroom remained bare for weeks because no one remembered to include her in the rotation for displaying student work in the main hallway, an oversight that went unnoticed until Sarah quietly created her own display. Without asking for assistance or acknowledgement, holiday celebrations provided particularly painful reminders of Sarah's isolation from the school community, as gift exchanges and party planning occurred through informal networks that somehow never included her participation. When Secret Santa assignments were distributed in December, Sarah's name appeared on the recipient list, but she wasn't assigned anyone to shop for, creating an awkward situation where she received a generic gift card while having no opportunity to participate in the reciprocal gesture that defined the tradition. Margaret apologized for the computer error, but the damage was done, reinforcing Sarah's status as someone who existed on the periphery of community celebrations. The cumulative effect of these daily microaggressions was a constant low-level stress that Sarah recognized from her military training as a psychological warfare technique designed to undermine confidence and social cohesion. The irony was not lost on her that the same tactics used by enemy forces to demoralize American troops were being employed by elementary school teachers to maintain their social hierarchy. Unlike her military experience, however, Sarah had no support network or chain of command to address these issues, leaving her to endure the subtle persecution while maintaining the professional demeanor that was essential to protecting her cover identity. Sarah's response to this treatment was to withdraw even further into herself, reinforcing the cycle of exclusion while protecting the emotional vulnerability that made these slights so painful. She arrived at school each morning, prepared for another day of polite hostility disguised as professional concern, knowing that her colleagues' assessment of her as weak and unremarkable was essential to maintaining the peaceful anonymity she needed to heal from her previous life. What none of them understood was that every slight, every dismissive comment, and every casual exclusion was being cataloged by someone whose training had taught her to recognize patterns of behavior and assess potential threats with deadly accuracy. The nightmares began 3 months after Sarah's discharge from active duty, always starting with the same suffocating heat of an Afghan summer afternoon when the temperature reached 118 degrees and the air shimmered like liquid glass above the rocky terrain outside Forward Operating Base Chapman. In her dreams, she could still smell the mixture of diesel fuel, burning metal, and something else she refused to identify. Could still hear the crackling radio communications that had seemed so routine until everything went catastrophically wrong in the span of 17 seconds that changed the trajectory of her entire life. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been leading a 4-person special operations team on what intelligence reports classified as a routine extraction mission, retrieving a high-value asset from a compound 12 kilometers northeast of Kandahar, where Taliban forces had been holding an American journalist for 6 weeks. The operation should have been textbook fast insertion, precise neutralization of hostile forces, secure the package, and extraction before enemy reinforcements could respond. Sarah's team had executed dozens of similar missions with flawless precision, earning a reputation within Special Operations Command as the unit you called when failure wasn't an option and collateral damage had to remain zero. Sergeant First Class Marcus Rodriguez had been Sarah's spotter and closest friend for 3 years, a former gang member from East Los Angeles who had transformed himself into one of the military's most skilled reconnaissance specialists after joining the Army to escape a life that was heading toward prison or death. Marcus possessed an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and predict enemy movement patterns, skills that had kept their team alive through operations in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan and Iraq. His easy humor and unwavering loyalty had made him the emotional anchor of their unit, the person who could diffuse tension with a perfectly timed joke or provide encouragement during the darkest moments of their deployment. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Chung, their communications expert and medic, had grown up in a military family and possessed the kind of technical brilliance that made complex electronic warfare seem effortless. Her ability to maintain communications in hostile environments while simultaneously providing medical support had saved countless lives during their deployment, earning her 2 Bronze Stars and the quiet respect of every special operations unit in the theater. Jennifer's dry wit and fierce competitiveness had made her Sarah's closest female friend in a military community where women in combat roles were still fighting for acceptance and credibility. The 4th member of their team was Corporal David Thompson, a young explosives expert from rural Montana, whose farm boy appearance concealed a genius-level understanding of demolitions and electronic countermeasures. At 22, David was the youngest member of their unit, but had already proven himself capable of disarming improvised explosive devices that had stumped more experienced technicians. His quiet professionalism and absolute reliability had earned him a place on their team despite his relative inexperience, and Sarah had been preparing to recommend him for promotion to sergeant. The mission began exactly as planned, with their team infiltrating the target compound under cover of darkness and neutralizing 6 Taliban guards with the silent efficiency that characterized all special operations. They located the journalist, confirmed his identity, and began the extraction sequence that should have resulted in a routine helicopter pickup at a predetermined landing zone 800 meters from the compound. Sarah remembered the feeling of relief that had washed over her as they moved through the darkness toward their extraction point, carrying the wounded but conscious journalist while maintaining perfect tactical formation. The improvised explosive device that killed 3 members of her team had been buried in the road for weeks, waiting for exactly the kind of high-value target that would justify its use. Intelligence reports later revealed that Taliban forces had been monitoring American communication frequencies and had deliberately allowed the rescue mission to succeed, knowing that the real prize was eliminating an entire special operations team during what appeared to be a successful extraction. The explosion was perfectly timed to maximize casualties, while leaving 1 survivor who could provide intelligence about American special operations, tactics, and capabilities. Sarah's survival was due to nothing more than random chance. She had been walking point 15 meters ahead of her team when the device detonated with enough force to create a crater 12 feet deep and 20 feet across. The blast wave threw her 30 meters through the air, leaving her unconscious with a concussion, fractured ribs, and shrapnel wounds that would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. When she regained consciousness 47 minutes later, the compound was swarming with enemy forces searching for survivors, and her 3 closest friends were dead. The official after-action report classified the mission as a tactical success because the journalist was recovered alive and no classified information was compromised. But Sarah knew the brutal truth that would never appear in any military document. Her decision to take point position had been based on overconfidence rather than tactical necessity, a split-second choice that had saved her life while condemning her teammates to death. Marcus, Jennifer, and David had died because their team leader had made a decision based on personal preference rather than optimal mission planning, and no amount of official commendation could change that fundamental reality. The guilt that consumed Sarah during her medical recovery was unlike anything she had experienced during 8 years of combat operations. She had lost soldiers under her command before, but those deaths had occurred during legitimate combat engagements where enemy action was the primary cause of casualties. This time, she couldn't escape the knowledge that different leadership decisions would have resulted in different outcomes, that her 3 friends would still be alive if she had maintained proper tactical spacing or chosen a different route. To the extraction point, the Army's counseling services provided clinical support for post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor guilt. But the therapists couldn't address the specific type of guilt that comes from being the only person who knows exactly how preventable a tragedy really was. Sarah's sessions with military psychologists focused on helping her understand that combat casualties were inevitable and that no commander could prevent all losses. But these well-intentioned reassurances missed the crucial point that this particular loss had been entirely preventable through better decision-making. Her decision to leave active duty came during a conversation with Marcus Rodriguez's mother at his funeral. When the grieving woman took Sarah's hands and thanked her for bringing her son home, Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about how proud Marcus had been to serve under Sarah's command, and how often he had mentioned her leadership in letters home, expressing complete confidence in her ability to keep their team safe. The gap between Mrs. Rodriguez's perception of Sarah as a heroic leader and Sarah's knowledge of her own catastrophic failure was too enormous to bridge, making continued military service psychologically impossible. The transition to civilian life was complicated by Sarah's complete loss of confidence in her decision-making abilities, a fundamental skill that had defined her identity throughout her adult life. Teaching seemed like a natural choice because it involved protecting and nurturing rather than making tactical decisions that could result in death. But even lesson planning and classroom management reminded her of the analytical processes that had failed so catastrophically in Afghanistan. Every choice, from selecting reading materials to arranging student seating, became an exercise in second-guessing that left her emotionally exhausted. Sarah's careful construction of her new identity as a mild-mannered elementary school teacher was motivated by more than just the desire for anonymity. It was an attempt to become someone incapable of making the kind of decisions that had killed her friends. By embracing passivity and avoiding leadership roles, she hoped to prevent future situations where her judgment could harm people she cared about. The irony was that her colleagues' assessment of her as weak and indecisive was exactly the persona she was trying to cultivate, making their dismissive treatment a painful confirmation that her transformation was succeeding. The locked gun safe in her bedroom closet contained more than just her service weapon. It held the medals and commendations that represented a version of herself she could no longer access without overwhelming guilt. The Bronze Stars and Purple Heart meant nothing when weighed against the knowledge that Marcus, Jennifer, and David would never receive the recognition they deserved for their service and sacrifice. Sarah visited their graves every year on the anniversary of their deaths, but she had never spoken aloud at their gravesites because she couldn't find words that adequately expressed her responsibility for their deaths. The careful emotional distance she maintained from her students and colleagues at Lincoln Elementary was designed to prevent the kind of personal attachments that made leadership decisions so devastating when they went wrong. By remaining professionally competent but emotionally uninvested, Sarah believed she could fulfill her duties without creating situations where her judgment could harm people who trusted her. What she hadn't anticipated was how the very qualities that made her an effective teacher, protectiveness, situational awareness, and instinctive tactical thinking, would become impossible to suppress when genuine danger threatened the children she had grown to care about despite her best efforts to remain detached. Every night after the school hallways emptied and the custodial staff finished their rounds, Sarah would wait until the parking lot was completely deserted before retrieving a worn duffel bag from the trunk of her Honda Civic and making her way to the gymnasium through the side entrance she had learned to unlock with techniques that definitely weren't part of any teacher training manual. The old gym at Lincoln Elementary became her sanctuary between the hours of 10 p.m. and midnight, a place where she could maintain the skills that had once defined her identity while processing the guilt and hypervigilance that civilian life couldn't quite suppress. The physical training routine Sarah maintained in secret was far more comprehensive than anything required for elementary school teaching, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon the discipline that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat operations. She had installed a pull-up bar in an unused storage closet, hidden behind old gymnastics mats that hadn't been used since the previous decade, and created a circuit training course using the school's existing equipment in ways that would have baffled the physical education instructor, who used the same space during regular hours. Her workouts began with 45 minutes of cardiovascular conditioning that started with running the perimeter of the gymnasium at varying speeds, simulating the kind of irregular movement patterns that characterized combat situations where maintaining consistent pace could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah would then transition to agility drills using the basketball court's painted lines as a complex obstacle course, practicing the kind of rapid directional changes that had allowed her to navigate urban warfare environments where enemy fire could come from any angle without warning. The strength training component of her routine focused specifically on functional movements that related to her previous military role rather than general fitness goals. She practiced rope climbing using the gymnasium's old climbing rope, maintaining the grip strength and upper body endurance necessary for rapid building entry and extraction operations. Her core stability work involved exercises designed to maintain shooting accuracy while under physical stress, because muscle memory from years of combat training couldn't be completely erased even when she desperately wanted to forget everything associated with her former life. Sarah had constructed a makeshift tactical training area in the school's basement storage room, using maintenance supplies and old furniture to create scenarios that allowed her to practice room clearing procedures and threat assessment, protocols that remained embedded in her muscle memory despite 3 years of attempted civilian life. She moved through these exercises with the fluid precision of someone whose survival had once depended on perfect execution, clearing corners and assessing sight lines with an efficiency that would have impressed her former commanding officers. Most psychologically challenging aspect of her secret training involved maintaining her marksmanship skills using a modified air rifle she had purchased specifically for indoor practice. Sarah had created a shooting range in the basement using official law enforcement targets positioned at distances that corresponded to the typical engagement ranges she had encountered during special operations missions. Every night, she fired exactly 50 rounds at various targets while practicing the breathing and trigger control techniques that had once made her one of the most accurate shooters in her unit. These practice sessions weren't driven by any expectation that she would ever need these skills again. Sarah had convinced herself that her military training was a relic of a previous life that had no relevance to elementary education in suburban Connecticut. Instead, the training served as a form of meditation that helped her process the trauma and guilt that traditional therapy hadn't been able to address. The familiar routine of weapons maintenance, tactical movement, and precision shooting provided structure and purpose during the hours when nightmares and survivor guilt made sleep impossible. Sarah's apartment had been transformed into an extension of her training facility, with furniture arranged to facilitate tactical movement drills and mirrors positioned to allow her to practice hand-to-hand combat techniques without attracting attention from neighbors. Her bedroom closet contained more than just her locked gun safe. It held tactical gear, communications equipment, and survival supplies that represented thousands of dollars worth of military-grade equipment she couldn't bring herself to dispose of despite having no logical reason to maintain such preparations. The technical skills that had made her valuable as a special operations team leader required constant practice to maintain proficiency, and Sarah found herself unable to abandon capabilities that had been developed through years of intensive training and combat experience. She practiced lock-picking using the various doors and cabinets throughout her apartment, maintained her electronic surveillance skills by monitoring police radio frequencies, and kept her map reading and navigation abilities sharp by creating detailed tactical assessments of her neighborhood that included escape routes, defensive positions, and potential threats. Her language skills, developed for operations in multiple countries, were maintained through online courses and conversation practice that she disguised as personal enrichment activities when colleagues occasionally asked about her evening routines. Sarah could still speak conversational Arabic, Pashto, and Farsi with enough fluency to conduct intelligence-gathering operations, skills that seemed absurdly irrelevant to third-grade education, but that she couldn't bring herself to let atrophy completely. The first aid and medical training that had been essential for special operations. Work was perhaps the most practical skill Sarah maintained during her civilian life, though she had to be careful not to demonstrate knowledge that would raise questions about her background. When a student suffered a playground injury that left other teachers panicking, Sarah had to consciously limit her response to basic first aid rather than the advanced trauma care she was capable of providing. These moments of forced incompetence were particularly painful because they reminded her of Jennifer Chang's medical expertise and how her friend's skills might have saved lives if Sarah's leadership decisions hadn't gotten her killed. The psychological warfare training that had been part of Sarah's special operations preparation proved surprisingly relevant to navigating the social dynamics at Lincoln Elementary, though she used these skills defensively rather than offensively. She could read her colleagues' emotional states and motivations with an accuracy that would have been useful for interrogation work, but instead she used this knowledge to avoid conflicts and maintain her carefully constructed persona as a harmless, unremarkable teacher. Sarah's intelligence-gathering habits remained active despite her civilian environment, leading her to compile detailed profiles of her colleagues, students, and their families that went far beyond what any teacher would normally know or need. She knew which parents had financial difficulties, which students came from homes with domestic violence issues, and which teachers had personal problems that affected their job performance. This information was gathered through observation and analysis rather than any deliberate investigation, but the resulting knowledge base was comprehensive enough to support tactical planning if such planning ever became necessary. The counterintelligence training that had protected Sarah and her team during covert operations influenced her approach to maintaining her cover identity at Lincoln Elementary. She had created a complete backstory that could withstand casual investigation, complete with false references and a carefully constructed social media presence that supported her persona as a lifelong educator with no military connections. Even her apartment lease and bank accounts were designed to create a paper trail that would satisfy background checks while concealing any evidence of her true identity. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sleep remained elusive despite the physical exhaustion created by her nightly training routines, because Sarah's hypervigilance never completely shut down even in the safety of her own apartment. She slept with her service weapon within reach and maintained situational awareness that automatically cataloged every sound and movement in her building throughout the night. This constant state of tactical readiness was exhausting and probably unnecessary, but 8 years of combat operations had created neural pathways that couldn't be easily rewired through civilian living, the most difficult aspect of maintaining her military skills while pretending to be a mild-mannered teacher was the constant internal conflict between her trained instincts and her chosen persona. When Sarah observed potential security vulnerabilities at Lincoln Elementary, unlocked doors, inadequate visitor screening procedures, poor sight lines in hallways, her tactical training demanded that she address these issues, but her cover identity required that she ignore problems that weren't her responsibility. This ongoing tension between competence and concealment created a psychological strain that made her secret training sessions even more necessary as a form of stress relief. Sarah's dedication to maintaining her military capabilities was motivated by more than just habit or psychological necessity. It was driven by a deep-seated belief that she owed it to Marcus, Jennifer, and David to remain worthy of the training they had shared and the skills they had died protecting. Every night of practice was a memorial to her fallen teammates, a promise that their sacrifice wouldn't be diminished by allowing their shared expertise to atrophy through disuse. She couldn't bring them back, but she could honor their memory. By maintaining the standards of excellence they had all embraced as special operations soldiers. The statewide school safety assessment, scheduled for Tuesday, November 15th, was supposed to be a routine evaluation that would result in updated emergency protocols and perhaps some minor recommendations for improving Lincoln Elementary's security infrastructure. State officials had been conducting these assessments at schools throughout Connecticut following a series of incidents at other educational facilities, and Principal Rodriguez had spent weeks preparing staff presentations and organizing documentation that would demonstrate their commitment to student safety and emergency preparedness. The assessment team consisted of 3 state education officials, 2 representatives from the Connecticut Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection, and a federal consultant whose background in school security systems had made him a sought-after expert following recent nationwide concerns about educational facility vulnerabilities. These officials arrived at Lincoln Elementary with clipboards, measuring devices, and a comprehensive checklist that would evaluate everything from building access controls to communication systems and evacuation procedures. Sarah watched the assessment team moved through the building with the kind of professional detachment she had cultivated over 3 years of teaching. But her military training automatically began cataloging the serious security deficiencies that the officials were documenting with increasing concern. The main entrance lacked adequate sightlines for monitoring approaching visitors. The visitor management system relied on outdated technology that could be easily compromised, and the interior hallways created multiple blind spots that would complicate evacuation procedures during an emergency situation. The school's communication system was perhaps the most concerning vulnerability, consisting of an aging intercom network that provided inconsistent coverage throughout the building, and emergency phones that connected to a central office rather than directly to local law enforcement. During the assessment team's testing procedures, several classrooms experienced complete communication failures, and the backup systems proved inadequate for coordinating responses during simulated emergency scenarios that revealed gaps in both technology and training. Margaret Chun had volunteered to serve as the faculty liaison for the assessment, eager to demonstrate her leadership capabilities and intimate knowledge of Lincoln Elementary's operations. However, her presentations to the assessment team revealed a troubling lack of understanding about actual security procedures, with responses that focused on administrative policies rather than practical emergency management. When asked about lockdown procedures, Margaret provided detailed explanations of paperwork requirements and notification protocols while failing to address fundamental tactical considerations like sightlines, escape routes, and threat assessment. Procedures. The physical security assessment revealed that Lincoln Elementary's building design, constructed in the 1970s during an era when school security wasn't a primary concern, created numerous challenges for effective emergency response. The building had multiple entrances that couldn't be adequately monitored from a central location, long corridors with limited visibility, and classroom configurations that would complicate evacuation during various emergency scenarios. The windows in most classrooms were too high for emergency egress, and the fire escape routes passed through areas that would be vulnerable during certain types of security incidents. Principal Rodriguez accompanied the assessment team throughout their evaluation, becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of Lincoln Elementary's security deficiencies became apparent. The school's emergency supplies were inadequate. Their staff training records showed significant gaps in recent preparation, and their coordination protocols with local law enforcement hadn't been updated in over 5 years. When the federal consultant asked specific questions about threat response procedures, Rodriguez had to admit that their current policies were based on generic templates rather than site-specific tactical planning. The assessment team's evaluation of staff preparedness revealed another layer of concerning inadequacies when they conducted interviews with faculty members about their understanding of emergency procedures. Most teachers could recite basic lockdown steps and evacuation routes, but few understood the strategic reasoning behind specific protocols or possessed the situational awareness necessary to adapt procedures during dynamic emergency situations. Their responses suggested that emergency training had focused on compliance rather than practical effectiveness. Sarah observed these interviews with growing unease, recognizing that her colleagues' lack of tactical understanding would create serious vulnerabilities during any actual emergency situation. When Margaret Chun confidently explained that teachers should follow the prescribed procedures exactly as written, Sarah's military training identified this approach as potentially catastrophic during scenarios where rigid adherence to predetermined plans could result in casualties that flexible tactical thinking might prevent. The technology assessment revealed that Lincoln Elementary security systems were outdated and inadequately integrated, with surveillance cameras that provided poor image quality, access control systems that relied on easily compromised card readers, and alarm systems that couldn't differentiate between different types of threats. The assessment team expressed particular concern about the school's inability to quickly isolate different areas of the building during emergencies, a capability that modern security experts considered essential for effective incident management. When the federal consultant asked about staff members with relevant security experience or military backgrounds, Principal Rodriguez and Margaret Chun exchanged glances before admitting that they weren't aware of any teachers with specialized training in emergency response or tactical operations. This revelation was particularly troubling to the assessment team because research had shown that schools with staff members who possessed relevant expertise were significantly more effective at managing crisis situations and protecting student welfare during emergencies. The assessment team's evaluation of Lincoln Elementary's relationship with local law enforcement revealed another significant gap in emergency preparedness, with police response protocols that were based on outdated assumptions about school building layouts and communication capabilities. The most recent joint training exercise had occurred over 2 years ago, and current staff members weren't familiar with the specific procedures that local police would follow during different types of emergency responses. Sarah listened to these discussions while maintaining her carefully constructed persona of mild interest, but her military training was automatically developing tactical assessments and identifying solutions that could address many of the vulnerabilities the assessment team was documenting. Her special operations background had included extensive training in facility security, threat assessment, and emergency response coordination. Exactly the expertise that Lincoln Elementary desperately needed but didn't know existed within their own faculty. The assessment team's preliminary findings, shared with Principal Rodriguez during a closed-door meeting, included recommendations for significant upgrades to physical security systems, comprehensive staff retraining, and the development of new emergency protocols that would address the specific vulnerabilities they had identified. The estimated cost of implementing these recommendations exceeded the school's annual security budget by a factor of 4, creating financial pressures that would require district-level approval and potentially years of phased implementation. More concerning than the financial implications were the assessment team's warnings about Lincoln Elementary's current vulnerability to various types of emergency situations. The federal consultant, speaking with the blunt honesty that characterized security professionals, explained that the school's existing protocols and infrastructure would be inadequate for protecting students and staff during several realistic threat scenarios that other Connecticut schools had already experienced. The timing of these revelations created additional pressure because the assessment was occurring during a period of heightened concern about school safety throughout the region. Recent incidents at educational facilities in neighboring states had prompted increased media attention and parental anxiety. making Lincoln Elementary's security deficiencies a potential public relations crisis as well as a genuine safety concern. That required immediate attention and resources the school didn't possess. Margaret Chun's response to the assessment team's findings focused primarily on bureaucratic concerns about implementation timelines and budget approvals, revealing her inability to grasp the tactical implications of the vulnerabilities they had identified. Her questions about paperwork requirements and administrative procedures demonstrated the kind of institutional thinking that prioritized compliance over effectiveness, exactly the mindset that Sarah's military experience had taught her to recognize as dangerous during crisis situations. The assessment team scheduled a follow-up visit for the following month, allowing Lincoln Elementary time to begin implementing immediate improvements that could address the most critical vulnerabilities without requiring major budget expenditures. However, their preliminary report made clear that comprehensive security improvements would require expertise and resources that the school currently lacked, creating a situation where administrative solutions would be inadequate for addressing tactical realities. As the assessment team concluded their evaluation and prepared to leave Lincoln Elementary, Sarah realized that their findings had created exactly the kind of security vacuum that her military training had taught her to recognize as extremely dangerous. The school was now documented as vulnerable, their staff was inadequately prepared, and their systems were insufficient for protecting the 200 children who trusted Lincoln Elementary to keep them safe during the hours they spent within its inadequately secured walls. When Sarah quietly raised her hand during the emergency faculty meeting convened immediately after the security assessment team's departure, suggesting that Lincoln Elementary might benefit from consulting with someone who had relevant tactical experience, the response from her colleagues revealed the depth of their dismissive attitude toward her potential contributions. Margaret Chun turned in her chair to look at Sarah with the kind of patronizing smile typically reserved for children who had misunderstood adult conversations, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who clearly wasn't qualified to participate in serious discussions. "Sarah, that's a thoughtful suggestion," Margaret began, her words carefully chosen to sound supportive while simultaneously undermining the validity of the proposal. "But I think you might be overestimating the complexity of what we're dealing with here. These are established educational protocols that have been developed by experts who understand school environments much better than military consultants who don't have experience with children and classroom management." The implicit message was clear. Sarah's suggestion revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of both the problem and appropriate solutions, marking her once again as someone whose input was well-intentioned but ultimately irrelevant. Principal Rodriguez nodded along with Margaret's assessment, adding her own diplomatic rejection that managed to sound appreciative, while completely dismissing Sarah's offer to help address the security vulnerabilities that had been identified during the assessment. "We appreciate everyone's willingness to contribute ideas," Rodriguez said, looking around the room to include Sarah in her general thanks while making it clear that specific suggestions weren't needed. "But the district has very particular procedures for handling security upgrades, and we need to work within established channels rather than pursuing informal consultations that might complicate our relationship with state officials." The younger teachers exchanged glances that suggested they found Sarah's attempt to contribute somewhat presumptuous, given her typical silence during faculty meetings and her general reputation for avoiding involvement in school-wide initiatives. Jessica Rodriguez, the principal's niece, whispered something to the teacher sitting beside her that prompted a barely suppressed smile, the kind of reaction that indicated Sarah's colleagues found her sudden interest in security matters somewhat amusing rather than potentially valuable. When Sarah persisted with her suggestion, explaining that she had noticed several specific vulnerabilities that could be addressed with relatively simple modifications to existing procedures, Margaret's response became more directly dismissive, her professional courtesy giving way to the kind of impatience typically reserved for individuals who didn't understand their proper place in organizational hierarchies. "Sarah, I'm sure you mean well, but this really isn't the time for brainstorming sessions from people who don't have relevant expertise," Margaret said, her voice carrying an edge that made several teachers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We need to focus on practical solutions that work within our educational framework, not theoretical ideas that might sound good, but don't account for the realities of elementary school operations." The dismissal was particularly painful because Sarah knew that her assessment of Lincoln Elementary's vulnerabilities was based on the same tactical analysis training that had kept her special operations team alive during dozens of high-risk missions in hostile environments. She could see exactly how the building's layout created fatal funnels during emergency evacuations, how the communication systems would fail during crisis situations, and how the staff's current training would result in preventable casualties if they faced the kind of threats that other schools had already experienced. Her colleagues' refusal to even consider her input wasn't just personally humiliating, it was professionally irresponsible in ways that could have life-or-death consequences. David Park, the second-grade teacher whose political awareness made him sensitive to faculty dynamics, attempted to mediate the growing tension by suggesting that all ideas should be considered, but his diplomatic intervention only served to highlight how unusual Sarah's participation had become. "Maybe we should hear what Sarah has in mind," he offered, though his tone suggested he was motivated more by fairness than genuine interest in her suggestions. "It can't hurt to get different perspectives on something this important." His well-intentioned support actually made Sarah's position more uncomfortable by drawing additional attention to her deviation from her usual pattern of silent observation. Margaret's response to David's suggestion revealed the extent to which she viewed Sarah's input as not just irrelevant, but potentially disruptive to the established order of faculty decision-making. "David, I appreciate your inclusiveness, but we really need to stay focused on actionable solutions rather than getting sidetracked by every random idea that gets suggested," she said, her choice of words making it clear that she considered Sarah's contributions to be exactly the kind of distraction that effective leadership needed to manage. "The assessment team gave us very specific recommendations, and our job is to implement those recommendations efficiently rather than second-guessing experts who actually understand school security." The meeting continued with detailed discussions of budget requirements, implementation timelines, and administrative procedures, but Sarah's attempted contribution had been so thoroughly dismissed that she felt invisible for the remainder of the session. Her colleagues discussed security improvements with the kind of theoretical understanding that characterized people who had never faced actual threats, focusing on compliance requirements and bureaucratic processes rather than the tactical realities that would determine whether their students survived if Lincoln Elementary ever faced a genuine emergency. When Linda Foster raised concerns about the financial cost of implementing the recommended security upgrades, her questions revealed the same gap between administrative thinking and tactical necessity that Sarah's military experience had taught her to recognize as dangerous. Linda wanted to know whether they could phase in improvements over several years to spread out the expense, apparently not understanding that security vulnerabilities couldn't be partially addressed without creating new weaknesses that sophisticated threats would exploit. Sarah remained silent, knowing that any attempt to explain these tactical principles would be dismissed as irrelevant theorizing from someone who didn't understand budget constraints. The discussion of staff training requirements provided another opportunity for Sarah to contribute valuable insights based on her extensive experience with emergency response protocols. But Margaret's earlier dismissal had made it clear that further suggestions would be unwelcome. Sarah listened to her colleagues debate training schedules and certification requirements while mentally cataloging the fundamental flaws in their approach. They were treating emergency preparedness as an administrative compliance issue rather then a tactical skill set that required ongoing practice and psychological preparation. Patricia Williams, Margaret's longtime ally, suggested that the school could save money by having current staff members conduct training sessions rather than hiring outside consultants, not understanding that effective emergency response training required expertise that elementary school teachers typically didn't possess. Her proposal to create internal training teams revealed the same overconfidence that had characterized the faculty's response to Sarah's suggestions, the assumption that good intentions and administrative authority could substitute for specialized knowledge and tactical experience. The meeting concluded with assignments for various committee memberships and research tasks that were distributed among the faculty based on seniority and established relationships rather than relevant expertise or capability. Sarah wasn't assigned to any of the security-related committees, despite her obvious interest in contributing to solutions, because her colleagues had already determined that her input would be more hindrance than help. Margaret volunteered to chair the main Security Implementation Committee, ensuring that improvements would be managed by someone whose understanding of tactical principles was limited to theoretical knowledge gained through administrative training. As the faculty members filed out of the meeting room, several stopped to continue their discussions in small groups that naturally excluded Sarah from their planning sessions. She overheard fragments of conversations about budget priorities and training schedules, discussions that revealed her colleagues' continued focus on administrative processes rather than the practical effectiveness of security measures. Their exclusion of her from these informal planning sessions wasn't deliberately cruel, but it demonstrated how completely her potential contributions had been dismissed and forgotten. The most frustrating aspect of Sarah's exclusion from security planning wasn't the personal slight. She had endured worse treatment during her 3 years at Lincoln Elementary, but the professional knowledge that her colleagues were making decisions that could result in preventable casualties during emergency situations. Her special operations training had included extensive study of institutional failures during crisis events, and she recognized the same patterns of overconfidence, inadequate preparation, and resistance to external expertise that had characterized organizations that failed to protect the people depending on them for safety and security. Walking back to her classroom after the meeting, Sarah realized that her colleagues' dismissal of her suggestions had created a moral dilemma that her military training hadn't prepared her to handle. She possessed knowledge and skills that could potentially save lives, but sharing that expertise would require revealing her background and abandoning the carefully constructed anonymity that had allowed her to function in civilian life. The conflict between her duty to protect innocent people and her need to maintain emotional safety created the kind of impossible choice that had no clear resolution within the framework of elementary school politics and professional relationships. Opportunity that would forever change Sarah's life at Lincoln Elementary came from an unexpected source when Frank Martinez, the head custodian whose 15 years of maintaining the building had given him intimate knowledge of its vulnerabilities and operational challenges, approached her 3 days after the disastrous faculty meeting with a proposal that demonstrated his understanding of both the school's security problems and Sarah's unique qualifications to address them. Frank had been observing Sarah's behavior during her 3 years at Lincoln Elementary with the kind of careful attention that came from his background as a former military police officer who had served 2 tours in Iraq before transitioning to civilian work that allowed him to support his family while avoiding the combat deployments that had left him with his own collection of psychological scars and suppressed memories. Unlike the teaching faculty, Frank possessed enough military experience to recognize subtle indicators that suggested Sarah's background was far more complex than her mild-mannered persona indicated. The conversation began during Sarah's typical after-hours routine when she remained in her classroom long after other teachers had departed, ostensibly grading papers and preparing lessons, but actually waiting for the building to empty. so she could conduct her clandestine training sessions. In the gymnasium, Frank knocked softly on her classroom door, entering with the respectful caution of someone who understood that approaching a potential fellow veteran required careful consideration of boundaries and trust issues that civilians typically didn't comprehend. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me bothering you after hours," Frank began, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that military training embedded so deeply that it survived decades of civilian employment. "But I wanted to talk to you about something that's been on my mind since that security assessment last week. I've been working in schools for a long time, and I've never seen administrators get so concerned about vulnerabilities without having any practical ideas about how to address them." His approach was diplomatic but direct, testing whether Sarah would be receptive to a conversation that might venture into territory that her carefully constructed teacher persona was designed to avoid. Sarah's response was characteristically cautious, acknowledging Frank's concern, while maintaining the professional distance that had become her default mode of interaction with all school personnel. However, Frank's military bearing and obvious understanding of security issues created a dynamic that was different from her typical collegial interactions, prompting her to listen more carefully than she might have with purely civilian staff members who lacked relevant experience or expertise. Frank continued his careful approach by sharing his own background as a former military police officer, explaining how his experience with force protection and base security had given him perspectives on institutional vulnerabilities that differed significantly from the administrative approach that characterized most educational security planning. His willingness to reveal his military service was a calculated risk designed to create common ground and demonstrate that he understood the complexities of transitioning from military to civilian work environments. "The thing is," Frank said, settling into a student desk with the kind of easy movement that suggested familiarity with adapting to various environments, "I keep seeing things around this building that make me think we're not nearly as prepared as everyone wants to believe." The assessment team was being polite, but some of the vulnerabilities they identified are the kind that get people killed if something serious ever happens here. His directness was refreshing after days of listening to administrative discussions that treated security as a bureaucratic compliance issue rather than a matter of life and death. Sarah found herself responding to Frank's straightforward approach with more honesty than she had shown any colleague since arriving at Lincoln Elementary, though she remained careful not to reveal specific details about her military background or the extent of her tactical knowledge. Their conversation gradually evolved from general concerns about school security to more specific observations about the building's layout, staff preparedness, and the gap between official policies and practical effectiveness during emergency situations. Frank's proposal emerged gradually from their discussion, presented not as a formal plan but as a collaborative possibility that could address some of Lincoln Elementary's most critical vulnerabilities without requiring the budget approvals and administrative processes that were preventing meaningful security improvements. He suggested that Sarah might be willing to share some of her apparent knowledge about emergency procedures with interested staff members, framing her expertise as coming from personal interest and research rather than professional military training. The key insight that made Frank's proposal viable was his recognition that Sarah's effectiveness would depend on maintaining her cover identity while gradually introducing tactical concepts and security awareness in ways that appeared to be common sense improvements rather than military-derived solutions. He understood that revealing Sarah's true background would create the kind of disruption and scrutiny that would ultimately undermine her ability to contribute meaningfully to Lincoln Elementary's security posture. Frank's plan involved positioning Sarah as someone who had developed relevant knowledge through personal study and interest in school safety issues, allowing her to share tactical insights without explaining how she had acquired expertise that typically required years of specialized military training. This approach would protect her carefully constructed anonymity while enabling her to address the vulnerabilities that had been troubling her since the security assessment revealed the extent of Lincoln Elementary's inadequate preparation. The custodian's understanding of the school's internal politics was crucial to his proposal's feasibility, because he recognized that Margaret Chun and other senior faculty members would be more likely to accept security suggestions that came through unofficial channels rather than formal presentations that challenged their authority or expertise. Frank suggested that Sarah could begin by sharing observations and recommendations with individual teachers who might be receptive to practical advice, gradually building credibility that could eventually influence broader security policies. Frank's military experience had taught him to recognize the kind of institutional resistance that characterized organizations where bureaucratic processes took precedence over practical effectiveness, and he understood that meaningful change often required informal networks that bypassed official channels. His proposal acknowledged that Sarah's previous attempts to contribute through formal faculty meetings had failed not because her ideas lacked merit, but because the existing power structure was threatened by input from someone outside the established hierarchy. The conversation revealed Frank's own frustration with Lincoln Elementary's approach to security planning, because his maintenance responsibilities had given him detailed knowledge of the building's vulnerabilities that administrators consistently ignored or minimized. He had repeatedly submitted maintenance requests and security observations that were dismissed as outside his area of responsibility, creating the same kind of professional frustration that Sarah had experienced when her tactical insights were rejected during faculty discussions. Frank's proposal included specific strategies for gradually introducing improved security procedures that could be implemented without requiring administrative approval or significant budget expenditures. These suggestions demonstrated his understanding of both tactical principles and institutional dynamics, showing how security improvements could be presented as minor operational adjustments rather than major policy changes that would trigger bureaucratic resistance and delays. The custodian's willingness to risk his own professional standing by supporting Sarah's involvement in security planning revealed his genuine concern about student safety and his recognition that conventional approaches were inadequate for addressing the threats that other schools had already experienced. His proposal wasn't motivated by personal ambition or bureaucratic advancement, but by the kind of practical realism that characterized veterans who understood the difference between administrative compliance and actual effectiveness. Sarah's response to Frank's proposal was cautious but interested, because she recognized both the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to Lincoln Elementary's security posture and the risks associated with becoming more visible within the school's social and professional networks. Her military training had taught her to evaluate such opportunities carefully, weighing potential benefits against operational security concerns and long-term strategic implications. The discussion concluded with an agreement to continue their conversation and explore possibilities for implementing minor security improvements that could serve as a foundation for more comprehensive changes if initial efforts proved successful. Frank's approach had created the first genuine opportunity Sarah had encountered to use her military expertise in ways that could benefit Lincoln Elementary students and staff, while his understanding of institutional dynamics offered hope that such contributions could be made without destroying the carefully constructed anonymity that had allowed her to function in civilian life. Frank's parting comment revealed the depth of his understanding about Sarah's situation and the careful balance she was trying to maintain between helping others and protecting herself from the scrutiny that would inevitably follow if her true background became known. "Ma'am," he said, standing to leave her classroom, "I don't know what your story is, and I don't need to know. But I do know that sometimes the right person in the right place can make all the difference, and I think you might be that person for these kids." At exactly 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday, November 29th, while Sarah was helping 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez sound out challenging words in her reading workbook and the afternoon sun streamed through Lincoln Elementary's tall windows creating geometric patterns on the classroom floor. 3 armed men dressed in maintenance uniforms walked through the school's main entrance with the kind of calculated confidence that suggested months of careful planning and reconnaissance rather than impulsive criminal behavior. The initial breach of Lincoln Elementary's security occurred so smoothly that it took nearly 4 minutes for anyone to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with the men who had signed in as electrical contractors and bypassed the visitor screening procedures that were supposed to prevent exactly this type of unauthorized access. The school's outdated visitor management system, which the security assessment team had identified as a critical vulnerability, functioned exactly as the intruders had anticipated, providing them with official visitor badges and unrestricted access to hallways filled with children who had no reason to suspect that their safe educational environment had been compromised. Sarah's military training activated the moment she heard the distinctive sound of the main entrance being secured from the inside, metallic clicking that was subtle enough to escape civilian attention, but immediately recognizable to someone whose survival had once depended on identifying auditory signatures that indicated tactical situations in progress. Her hypervigilance, suppressed through 3 years of determined effort to embrace civilian normalcy, suddenly reasserted itself with the overwhelming clarity that characterized combat situations where split-second assessments determined life-or-death outcomes. The first confirmation that Lincoln Elementary was facing a genuine emergency came when the school's aging intercom system crackled to life with Principal Rodriguez's voice, carrying a tension that transformed her typically calm administrative announcements into something that made Sarah's blood pressure spike and her tactical awareness shift into the hyperacute focus that had kept her alive during special operations missions. "Teachers, please implement immediate lockdown procedures," Rodriguez's voice said, the careful control in her words revealing that she understood the gravity of their situation, even if she couldn't yet comprehend its full scope. Sarah's classroom of 22 third graders reacted to the lockdown announcement with the kind of confused compliance that characterized children who had practiced emergency drills without understanding their real-world implications. 8-year-old Marcus Thompson asked if this was another practice drill, while Emma Rodriguez looked toward the classroom door with the instinctive fear that young children developed when adult voices carried emotions they couldn't identify but recognized as dangerous. Sarah's response was to immediately activate protocols that her students had never seen before, moving with efficiency and purpose that transformed her from their mild-mannered teacher into someone whose competence and authority commanded instant obedience. Within seconds of hearing the lockdown announcement, Sarah had secured her classroom door using techniques that went far beyond the standard procedures outlined in Lincoln Elementary's emergency manual, positioning furniture to create defensive barriers while simultaneously conducting a tactical assessment of sight lines, escape routes, and potential defensive positions that could protect her students if the classroom security was breached. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, reflecting years of training that had become muscle memory rather than conscious decision-making. The school's communication systems began failing exactly as Sarah had predicted during her analysis of the security assessment findings, with classroom phones providing inconsistent connections and the intercom network experiencing the kind of systematic disruption that suggested the intruders possessed technical knowledge about educational facility infrastructure. Sarah realized that Lincoln Elementary was facing a coordinated attack rather than a spontaneous violent incident, a recognition that shifted her tactical thinking from reactive defense to proactive threat assessment and strategic planning. Through her classroom's windows, Sarah could observe portions of the school's exterior and parking lot, noting the presence of additional vehicles that hadn't been there during lunch period, and the absence of the immediate law enforcement response that should have materialized within minutes of a legitimate lockdown situation. Her special operations training had included extensive study of institutional attack methodologies, and she recognized the signature patterns of an operation that had been planned with sufficient sophistication to account for police response times and communication disruption. The sounds that began echoing through Lincoln Elementary's hallways confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the nature of the threat facing the school. As voices shouting commands in tones that civilian teachers had never heard, but that immediately transported Sarah back to combat zones where such vocal patterns indicated imminent violence and tactical escalation. Her students huddled in the corner of the classroom where she had positioned them, following her instructions with the kind of absolute trust that children placed in adults during situations they didn't understand but recognized as requiring complete obedience. Sarah's tactical assessment of her situation revealed both advantages and disadvantages that would determine her ability to protect her students and potentially assist other classrooms throughout the building. Her position on the second floor provided strategic elevation but complicated escape routes, while her classroom's layout offered decent defensive positions but limited options for offensive operations if such actions became necessary. Most critically, her students' safety depended entirely on her ability to maintain their security, while simultaneously determining whether she could contribute to the broader defensive efforts that would be required to protect all 200 children. Trapped within Lincoln Elementary. The failure of standard emergency procedures became apparent as minutes passed without the arrival of law enforcement or emergency medical services, confirming that the attackers had successfully disrupted communication systems and isolated Lincoln Elementary from outside assistance. Sarah realized that the school's faculty and staff were entirely dependent on their own resources and capabilities, a situation that revealed the fatal inadequacy of their preparation and training for the kind of sophisticated threat they were facing. From her position near the classroom windows, Sarah could observe portions of the school's main entrance and parking areas, noting tactical details that confirmed her assessment of the attack's coordination and planning. The intruders had positioned vehicles to control access routes and establish perimeters that would complicate law enforcement response, demonstrating the kind of operational sophistication that required military or paramilitary training rather than simple criminal intent. The psychological dimension of protecting her students while maintaining her cover identity created unprecedented stress for Sarah, as her tactical instincts demanded immediate action while her civilian persona required her to behave like a frightened teacher who possessed no special capabilities or knowledge. Her students were watching her every movement and expression, looking for reassurance and guidance that required her to project calm competence without revealing the extent of her tactical assessment and planning. Sarah's military training had included extensive preparation for hostage situations and civilian protection scenarios, giving her theoretical knowledge about the attackers, likely objectives and operational patterns that could help predict their movements and identify opportunities for defensive or offensive action. However, applying this knowledge within the constraints of an elementary school environment while protecting children who depended on her for their survival created complexities that no training scenario had fully anticipated. The sound of systematic movement through Lincoln Elementary's hallways indicated that the attackers were conducting methodical searches of the building, a pattern that suggested they had specific objectives rather than random violent intent. Sarah's analysis of these auditory cues provided critical intelligence about the threat's nature and timeline, information that could be crucial for determining when and how to take action that might protect not only her own students but potentially other classrooms throughout the school. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to be tested in ways that would either vindicate her decision to leave military service or prove that her skills and training remained essential for protecting innocent people who had no other source of protection. The 200 children trapped within Lincoln Elementary needed someone with her capabilities, But using those capabilities would forever end her anonymous life as a mild-mannered third-grade teacher who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with her guilt and memories. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly, as the sounds of the attackers moving through the building grew closer to her classroom and the failure of official response. Protocols made it clear that Lincoln Elementary's faculty, students, and staff had only Sarah's hidden expertise standing between them and a tragedy that would destroy dozens of families and shatter the illusion of safety that had made suburban education seem like a refuge from the violent reality she had spent 8 years fighting in distant countries without the sound of splintering wood from the classroom next door, followed by 9-year-old Ashley Chun's terrified scream that cut through the hallways like a blade through Sarah's carefully constructed civilian facade, triggered an instantaneous transformation that her students would later describe to investigators as watching their quiet teacher become someone else entirely in the space of a single heartbeat. The mild-mannered woman who had spent 3 years grading their spelling tests and helping them with arithmetic problems vanished completely, replaced by a tactical operator whose movements carried the lethal precision of someone whose survival had once depended on split-second decisions in hostile environments where hesitation meant death. Sarah's transition from protective teacher to active combatant occurred with such fluid efficiency that her students barely had time to register the change before she was moving through her classroom with purpose and authority that commanded instant obedience without requiring explanation. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not move. Do not make any sound," she told her 22 third graders in a voice that carried absolute authority, her tone cutting through their fear with the kind of calm competence that made children understand that their survival depended on following instructions perfectly. Within seconds, Sarah had retrieved items from her desk and supply closet that her students had never noticed but that represented years of careful preparation for situations she had hoped would never occur. The ceramic letter opener became an improvised weapon. The heavy-duty scissors were repositioned for tactical accessibility, and the first aid kit was moved to a location that would be available if medical attention became necessary. Her movements were economical and precise, reflecting training that had transformed everyday objects into tools that could save lives or eliminate threats depending on circumstances and necessity. The locked drawer in her desk revealed supplies that no elementary school teacher should have possessed: zip ties that could restrain attackers, emergency communication devices that operated on frequencies civilian equipment couldn't access, and medical supplies that went far beyond the basic first aid kit that school regulations required. Sarah's preparation for this moment had been unconscious but thorough, driven by tactical instincts that had never fully accepted the safety and predictability that suburban education was supposed to provide. Her assessment of the tactical situation unfolding throughout Lincoln Elementary took less than 30 seconds. As Sarah processed auditory intelligence that revealed the attackers' positions, movement patterns, and likely objectives with the kind of analytical speed that had once made her valuable to special operations commanders who needed accurate battlefield assessments under extreme pressure. 3 distinct voices, coordinated movement patterns, systematic room-by-room searches, and the absence of random violence suggested that this was a planned operation with specific goals rather than an impulsive attack by mentally unstable individuals. The decision to abandon her civilian identity and activate her military training wasn't conscious or deliberate. It was an instinctive response to imminent danger that activated neural pathways developed through years of combat experience and reinforced through 3 years of secret practice sessions in Lincoln Elementary's gymnasium. Sarah Mitchell, the unremarkable third-grade teacher, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, replaced by Captain Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, call sign Eagle 13, whose primary mission had suddenly become protecting 200 innocent children from threats that civilian authorities were proving inadequate to address. Her first tactical action involved establishing communication with other classrooms, using methods that bypassed the compromised school communication system. Utilizing hand signals through classroom windows and door panels that drew on military protocols for coordinating defensive operations when electronic communication was unavailable or unreliable. Sarah's ability to assess sightlines and establish visual communication networks demonstrated capabilities that her colleagues had never suspected, transforming her from an overlooked faculty member into the de facto tactical commander for Lincoln Elementary's defense. The response from other teachers who received Sarah's signals revealed the enormous gap between civilian panic and military training, as educators who had never faced genuine threats struggled to understand instructions that seemed impossibly complex while actually representing basic tactical communication. Margaret Chen's classroom was visible through the hallway windows, and Sarah could observe her colleagues mounting panic as she realized that their emergency procedures were inadequate for the situation they were facing. Frank Martinez appeared in Sarah's peripheral vision, moving through the hallways with the kind of tactical awareness that confirmed his military background and suggested that he understood the nature of the threat facing Lincoln Elementary. His positioning and movement patterns indicated that he was conducting reconnaissance and threat assessment, providing Sarah with additional intelligence about the attackers, locations and capabilities while demonstrating that she wasn't entirely alone in possessing relevant experience for managing this crisis. Sarah's analysis of the attackers' methodology revealed that they were conducting systematic searches designed to locate specific targets rather than engaging in random violence, a recognition that provided crucial intelligence about their timeline and objectives. This assessment allowed her to predict their movement patterns and identify opportunities for defensive action that could protect students while potentially disrupting the attackers' operational plan through tactical intervention that civilian law enforcement training hadn't prepared them to anticipate. The moment when Sarah transitioned from defensive positioning to active engagement came when she observed one of the attackers attempting to breach the kindergarten classroom where Linda Foster was struggling to maintain lockdown procedures with 5-year-old children who didn't understand why they needed to remain silent and motionless. Sarah's tactical training identified this as a critical intervention point where her action could prevent casualties among the school's most vulnerable students. Her movement through Lincoln Elementary's hallways demonstrated capabilities that years of secret training had maintained at combat readiness levels. As Sarah navigated the building's layout using tactical principles that transformed familiar educational spaces into a battlefield where cover, concealment, and strategic positioning would determine whether children lived or died. Her advance toward the kindergarten classroom was silent and purposeful, reflecting infiltration techniques that had once allowed her special operations team to neutralize threats without alerting nearby enemies, the confrontation that would forever change how Lincoln Elementary's faculty and students understood their quiet third-grade teacher occurred when Sarah encountered the lead attacker in the hallway outside Linda Foster's classroom, a moment that required her to choose between maintaining her civilian identity and protecting children who depended on her for their survival. The choice was instantaneous and irrevocable, as 3 years of suppressed military training erupted into decisive action that neutralized the threat with efficiency that stunned witnesses and probably saved multiple lives. The tactical engagement lasted less than 40 seconds, but its psychological impact on everyone who witnessed Sarah's transformation was profound and permanent. Teachers who had dismissed her as timid and unremarkable watched her demonstrate combat skills that belonged in military operations rather than elementary education, while students throughout the building heard sounds that confirmed their safety had been restored by someone whose capabilities had been invisible until the moment when those capabilities became essential for their survival. Frank Martinez's arrival at the scene provided crucial support and validation for Sarah's actions. as his military experience allowed him to understand and appreciate the tactical expertise she had demonstrated, while helping to secure the neutralized threat and coordinate with law enforcement officials, who were finally responding to the emergency. His presence also provided Sarah with someone who could help explain the situation to administrators and investigators without requiring her to reveal details about her military background that might compromise her ability to continue teaching. Immediate aftermath of the incident created chaos throughout Lincoln Elementary as students, teachers, and staff struggled to process what had occurred and understand how their mild-mannered colleague had possessed the skills necessary to protect them from threats that official procedures had proven inadequate to address. Sarah's demonstration of combat capabilities had saved lives, but it had also destroyed the carefully constructed anonymity that had allowed her to function in civilian life without confronting the guilt and trauma that had driven her from military service. As emergency responders secured the building and began the complex process of documenting the incident and interviewing witnesses, Sarah realized that her transformation from overlooked teacher to tactical hero had created new challenges that would require her to confront aspects of her identity and capabilities that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. The 200 children of Lincoln Elementary were safe, but the woman who had protected them would never again be able to hide behind the facade of ordinary incompetence that had once provided refuge from a military past that refused to remain buried in classified files and locked gun safes. The investigation that followed revealed Sarah's true identity to the media within 48 hours, transforming Lincoln Elementary's hero teacher into a national symbol of hidden courage and sacrifice. Captain Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, the decorated Special Forces veteran who had saved 200 children while disguising herself as an unremarkable educator, became the subject of countless interviews and documentary proposals that she politely but firmly declined. Margaret Chen's first words to Sarah after learning her true background were a whispered apology that carried the weight of 3 years of dismissive treatment. "We never knew," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You let us treat you like you were nobody special." Sarah's response was characteristic in its quiet dignity. "That was exactly the point. I needed to be nobody special." Principal Rodriguez offered Sarah any position she wanted within the district, understanding that Lincoln Elementary had been protected by someone whose qualifications exceeded those of any administrator she had ever met. However, Sarah's decision surprised everyone who expected her to leverage her newfound recognition into career advancement or public acclaim. She chose to remain exactly where she was, room 237, teaching 3rd grade to children who now looked at her with a mixture of awe and affection that made her daily work both more challenging and more rewarding than it had ever been. Her students understood that their quiet teacher was someone extraordinary, but they also learned that extraordinary people often chose ordinary lives for reasons that had nothing to do with their capabilities. Frank Martinez was promoted to head of security, implementing protocols that Sarah developed to address the vulnerabilities that had nearly resulted in tragedy. Together, they transformed Lincoln Elementary into a model of school safety that other districts studied and attempted to replicate. What incredible story of hidden heroism have you witnessed in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. You never know who among us carries extraordinary capabilities behind an ordinary facade. If you enjoyed discovering the truth about Sarah Mitchell's remarkable journey, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about everyday heroes whose courage changes everything when it matters most.